From Paris, I am going to give my speech. It's in the middle of night currently in Paris. Therefore, please be tolerant of me. I'm going to give my speech now, but it's a difficult time of the day. However, having said that, I'm very happy to be addressing you, everyone. Because of COVID-19, there is a limited opportunity to visit Japan. It's very unfortunate that I don't have the opportunity to visit. So just to see you in the audience on the screen, it makes me feel very nostalgic. I remember the times I have spent in Japan, which was truly enjoyable. Now, let me go into the main topic now. The world history is in transition. There is a climate change problem, and also the population decline is a major issue in Europe as well as Japan, in Eurasia, as well as in Russia. And it is likely that China will also be facing population decline, and immigration is increasing. This is becoming a major problem. There is also the aging of population that is very problematic. As I mentioned, in the regions that I mentioned, the birth rate is prevailing very low. And with the COVID-19 running rampant for months, we have been at home, staying at home. But honestly speaking, I believe that this is a warning, a trend that was occurring in the past, which has only accelerated. It isn't as if something completely new has emerged. That is not the case. With COVID-19, we are losing a sense of direction. And my most significant concern is that in this confusion of COVID-19, as geopolitical point of view, I think there is multi-polarization in the world. There is U.S. and there is China. On the other hand, the U.S. society is liberal democracy. It's representative. Our values are embodied in that democracy. In terms of culture, liberal democracy values exist in the United States. So there is affinity in the United States toward the United States. But on the other hand, we have the emerging China. And they are authoritarian and totalitarian. And China and Russia are very similar. Both countries are communist nations. They continue to be a communist nation. And in our Western perspective, they are the other side. That is the prevailing perspective. So this bipolarization is a source of concern for me. Climate change is also a major problem. But these problems must be subject to discussions amongst the countries. Otherwise, we cannot surmount these issues. We cannot find a solution. There are actors, humanitarian issues and realistic issues can be solved by countries in discussion. The Western world, as well as the major leaders in the United States, are now having a wrong idea about themselves. The democracy in the Western world is becoming an illusion now. Authoritarian system of China is being criticized. It is not pleasant for us, and it must be very difficult to live under such a regime. I agree with that. However, the reverse system must be compared. For example, in the United States, the people are thinking that they are believing that they are right in the direction that they are pursuing, and democracy is being successful. I think this is also a wrong idea. Time is very limited, but I want to convey to you this idea to you. Regarding the concept of democracy, there are two perspectives. It is a system, the freedom of speech and freedom of the press, as well as voting freedom and representative election. Systems exist. This is a democratic system. And in terms of system, the Western world is aspiring and continue to be a democratic nation. But there is also another perspective of democracy that I would like to raise your attention to. It's a mental system. In other words, when people mutual interaction or the level of affluence as well as social movement. In this perspective, they think they are egalitarian. They are equal. But that is different. I am saying that there is a transformation taking place in the Western world, especially in the United States. They are changing their direction. In order to illustrate this point, I want to say the 18th, 19th, 20th century democracy, how it was born, must be addressed first. This is a mentality that has arose. It has enabled democracy. It is a cultural system. It is based on a cultural system. The literacy was very important. The mass literacy has risen. And in the Middle Ages, the clergy were able to read and write, and the literacy continued to spread. And this is 100% literacy prior to reaching that level in Europe. In the 18th century and 19th century, a society in Europe felt that they will become literate. Ultimately, everyone will become literate. It's not just for the elite or the clergy. And with the prevalence of literacy, there were problems. There have been revolutions. But in various regions, democratic systems were established, and universal suffrage was provided to the people. Now, this kind of democracy format was based on the tradition as well as the anthropological system and with the family system. Based on that, so the democracies differ. So individualistic family system was established in France, and people were able to have freedom, and there was also equity amongst the siblings. But it's different in the UK. But in France, orthodox democracy emerged based on the family system of France with the increase in literacy, and the liberal democratic ideas became prevalent in France. But in other countries with increasing literacy, other types of democracies emerged. Japan was different. The family system is different to the French system. The Japanese system was basically the stem family, direct lineage based. It was a male dominated, and the firstborn son was leading the family. And so there was inequity and hierarchy existing amongst the siblings. And in fact, there is democracy as well as freedom of the press, freedom of speech in Japan. But if you look at the current political system, even it is not such a democracy as they have in the United States. You don't have two major parties. You have a multi-party system, but LDP is always taking the helm and always at the top. So within the LDP, amongst the functions of the LDP, there is more competition. There is exceptions, and there is also conflict. But generally speaking, such conflict is rare in Japan. The agricultural family, the father and the son relationship was very important amongst the siblings. The equality was provided in China as well as in Russia. Reading and writing, becoming literate, led to communism. So authoritarian democracy and could be bloody at times. It's an authoritarian democracy with the increase in literacy emerged. So it is the authoritarian as well as this is based on the agricultural society of each country. I think this is universal. And depending on the countries, there is a difference in the family system as well. This is in the recent past. But it is very important to understand the current state. It is still continuing. The education history remains intact for primary education as well as reading and writing, and the middle school, secondary, as well as higher education. And with the higher education becoming more prevalent, new education has led to the stratification of society. Very high education is enjoyed by a certain group. 20% or 30% or 40% have higher education in some countries. But people with high education, high level of education, will depend on the quality of the institution, the schools. But without being conscious of this, the mass literacy equity has been lost. New education has led to stratification. And in each of these countries, it is leading to inequity now. That is becoming more prevalent. This is the inequity that we are seeing, and we can explain the various phenomena based on this concept. For example, neoliberalism is a good case in point, and economic inequity and income disparity is also a good case in point, although it depends on country to country. In the United States, democracy is such that it is still pursuing a liberal route, a direction. But there is economic disparity, and it is proceeding to the extreme state. The top 1% in the United States in terms of income, the top 1% has 20% of the wealth of the nation. Japan could be similar to Europe, lower than the United States. So in that sense, Japan is similar to Europe. And what we have to realize in this context is the disparity, this fragmentation that is occurring. With the higher class, there is a fragmentation of mentality we are seeing in the Western world. Communism in Russia collapsed. In 1985 or 1990, a certain level of education has led to stratification. And that is the reason why it collapsed. Currently, 25% of the young population are now receiving higher education. Then the traditional democracy will be be undergoing change. In 1995, it started in the United States, in France. In Russia, in 1988, this trend began. So that is prior to the communism's collapse. I think this is very important.
And what is important is that when it comes to China, China has not yet reached this stage yet. It is often said that when it comes to Russia, from communism to market capitalism, there was a failure in the process. And in the case of China, China was successful in that area. That means from communism into market capitalism. But that is not the case. In the case of China, there was a backwardness in the area of education. That means stratification through education, that they are now approaching a crisis moment in that area. In the past, Western type of democracy, in the case of Russia, non-democracy, and the same case when it comes into China, there has been such an argument, but without notice, there is an oligarchical system that does exist. That means that there is an income gap and society is disintegrated. And on top of that, the mass cannot control politics. As a result of all those things, for example, in the case of the United States, the Western world has its own democratic values, and the United States was believed and to protect democratic values. But it seems to be rather unrealistic. That is because of the income gap is so extreme. Since 2000, the white population death rate from the age of 40 through 59, the death rate is increasing. In particular, this fact of rising death rate, in particularly concentrating on uneducated white population. Compared to the educated people, they are on average, there's no change, but uneducated people, those who have just graduated from senior high school, their death rate is increasing. The system is working. There are political parties functioning, and there are healthy confrontations. But that said, there is no meaningful political decisions are made. 30% of the population, the population, the death rate is not being lowered. Whether that kind of system can be called a democracy, there is an issue with regard to the mental aspect of democracy. I don't know how much time being left for me, but what I would like to highlight is not to denounce this kind of aspect or not making any judgment on that reality, or favoring an opposing system, a system that opposes it, for example, the Chinese system, or totalitarian regime like Russia. Russia is not a country that is not completely free, but we have to make a significant decision at this moment. There are lots of themes we have to face. With regard to the current status surrounding ourselves, we may be delusioned. We may have an illusion about ourselves. We believe there is liberalism, but that is not the fact, not the reality. We believe in democracy, but that may be a delusion or illusion, so to speak. That kind of a misconception enables us or bars us from looking into the reality. I just would like to share with you one example. The United States has been involved in a series of wars. In Africa, there are regional wars, but between the big powers, there are no such wars. And the number of deaths from war is decreasing. That is a good thing. But the only exception is the United States, in the name of the defense of democracy, but it has failed many times. And if you take a look at all those indicators, the collapse of the Soviet Union, I predicted the demise of the Soviet system from 1970 through to 1974. The infant death rate was increasing. Currently, it is lower compared to the United States. That means looking into the future, it is an authoritarian state, but it might develop into a system that may be accepted. The family systems in Russia and China, egalitarian in their essence. And what needs to be highlighted in this case is that they are pursuing a society that may be protected from inequality. Now, I would like to talk about the cases in Japan. Today, I was not touching upon Japan, but going forward, to what direction does Japan need to move into? This is the next topic I would like to talk about. Japan is a big power in the international community. Japan closely monitors how the rest of the world is moving. Japan needs to make a choice to the Western European values and in alliance with the United States. What choices are going to be made? To be aligned with which camp, so to speak? Needless to say, with the Western camp. But there should be a world vision that Japan needs to possess. Have I already talked 30 minutes? Have I talked 30 minutes already? Can you hear me? More.
Just about 30 minutes now.
Yes. Okay.
Can you conclude?
I'm very sorry. I'm obsessed with time because I know that being punctual in Japan is extremely important. So
yes, very important.
If I'd been giving a talk in French, I would have talked and talked and talked without paying attention to time. But when I talk to a Japanese audience,
yes. Merci beaucoup.
Attends, you see?
S'il vous plaît, arrête, s'il vous plaît.
So let's consider the talk is finished. I'll be happy to answer your question.
I think we may continue like this way, so we are going to stop the talk. And it was a very interesting talk. I think we have to look into the reality. That's what he's arguing for. We may be too much impacted by the delusion of democracy. And we have to use statistical numbers. For example, the death rate of white population in the United States. That's one statistics. And he also predicted the demise of the Soviet bloc based on the prediction of the death rate of infants. So starting from the facts is the important tool to come to a logical conclusion. That was very interesting.
Wondering if the democracy is an illusion, what would you like to do for the democracy itself? If democracy doesn't work, what kind of thought, sort of thinking, theory or ideology will take over the whole world. Hello.
Press, we can vote, and so on. What all I'm saying is that it would be better to accept, to see us as we are. That we stop talking about ourselves as representing liberal democracy, and perhaps admit that what the US stands for is a liberal oligarchy or plutocracy. History continues after democracy, because right now I'm talking about decision. We'll have to take decisions on the future. And what is happening now in the West is that politicians spend a lot of time pretending that they are part of a democratic system. In a country like France, and perhaps this applies to the US also, they spend more time fooling the people. I mean, going through an election process that is in fact meaningless, because what the voters want will not be taken into account, you see? And this is, at this point, this is an immense waste of time. I think we'd be better with a responsible oligarchy, you see, than with a sort of a disguised oligarchy. So all I'm saying is that a better consciousness would be more efficient if we are to take decisions and solve problems than losing our time pretending. Am I clear?
Yes, yes. Okay.
Perhaps this is a very Buddhist attitude, and what I'm recommending is that we get out of the illusion of things. You see, I don't know.
If we give up the kind of illusion of democracy, what kind of other flag people should follow? I mean, if the democracy is not functioning, and still the society needs some kind of flag, and the West has been following this democratic flag.
But perhaps it is all a question of, people, of course, people need food, people need to consume, but societies, if they want to function, must have a dream or positive values and so on. Perhaps seeing ourselves as we are would make it possible to have a more responsible upper class. You see, there was a time, I mean, before the age of democracy, aristocracies had values. I mean, they had a feeling of responsibility towards their nation, or towards their peasants, and so on. And so perhaps this is very strange for me. Please realize I'm French, and I'm talking from the country of liberty and equality. But what I'm saying is, at the point we've reached, perhaps what we need is some kind of new aristocratic values, where the people on top admit that they're on top and act in a more responsible way to the people. But perhaps I'm very close to some kind of traditional Japanese attitude.
Then what do you think of
big
China?
difference.
What do you think of China?
I
Because
think
there are
China,
few people controlling the country.
I think
Elite.
we must. I think we must. Yes, but we must admit that China is almost going back to totalitarian state. But I think it would be a mistake. I said that China is before the shift to oligarchy because of the development of upper educated class. But I think it would be the big mistake about China would be to consider Xi or the Communist Party come responsible for the system. There's an anthropology of China. There used to be, and there still is, a Chinese family system, which is authoritarian and egalitarian. And I think the problem with China is within the whole population. I mean, there's a sort of there is a value system in the Chinese population which is not individualistic, which is egalitarian, certainly, and people. It's a paradox. I mean, we have elections in France or the US, and everybody is against the government, displeased, I mean, furious. But in a country like China, of course, they don't have elections, and they have a police state. But I mean, if you take opinion polls, the majority of the people are completely happy with the system. So if you admit this is unpleasant, I mean, this is the idea that the way the individual acts is not the same in the US, in France, in Japan, China, or Russia, is painful in a way. It would be wonderful if all societies were alike and there was only one culture and so on. But if we admit that the Chinese people is not liberal in itself, I think perhaps it's easier to accept China as it is. So of course now we have a great deal of talk about the rising Chinese power and so on. Honestly, I'm a demographer, you see, and when the last Chinese census was published, we realized that the fertility rate in China is 1.3, which is to say that China is one East Asian country with a very low fertility. And this demographic element in itself tells us that there will be no Chinese domination of the world. So there is a temporary problem because Chinese production is very important, but the real problem in the coming years will not be rising Chinese power, but it will be the contraction of the Japanese labor force. And this will be a problem for Japan also, because one of the way Japan escaped temporarily from its demographic depression, well, you have a declining population in Japan, is by relocalizing a large part of the production in China. So the truth, of course, it will not do to be simply happy because China
Dr. Todd?
Yes.
Todd-san?
Yes, I'm too long.
Maybe this is almost the last question, but kind of about Japan.
Yes.
You wrote in many places, and most in a recent book, the biggest problem of Japan is a population problem, decreasing of population. Can you describe it, and what you can tell maybe some kind of suggestion what Japan should do?
This is a kind of, I'm very worried, but it's the question of consciousness of the problem. You see, it's in the West, we're not conscious of the priorities. I mean, if you look at the papers, geopolitics, you will see a lot of things about a military problem with China. That's the lowest level of consciousness. Then there'll be an economic problem. People will worry about the labor force and perhaps moving more women into the labor force and so on. But the truth about Japan, and I've been saying this for 20 years, is that you've had a very low fertility rate, like 1.4 children per woman. And now you have a decreasing population. And the only Japanese problem is a demographic problem. I mean, it is much more urgent or serious than the Chinese problem, if you think of it, you see? And what I'm worried about is when I first came to Japan at the beginning of the 90s, people were talking about demography, about a demographic problem. And they were telling me, but how do you do it? Do we do in France to have 2 children per woman? How do you do it? And so on. And so I said, well, this is Germany and the rest of Europe are much more like Japan. You're not alone having demographic problems. And I said, well, it's wonderful that Japan, at least in Japan, they are conscious of their demographic problem. And what's fascinating is that, well, almost perhaps 25 or 30 years later, and demography is still something you talk about in Japan, not acting, you see. There's something fascinating about this. So I'm more and more worried about the question of consciousness and or the lack of it, you see.
多分まあトッドさん話そうとするところ日本の問題も
Now, Todd-san, I'm sure you have many other points you'd like to discuss about Japan. We only have a few minutes left, however. Perhaps we can take one question from the floor. Or Takenaka-san, do you have a question? So, would anyone like a question? Please raise your hand if you have a question. I can't see. There's no one. Well, we have someone with a hand up, so perhaps we'll ask him. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Regarding demographics, you said that with that, the quality of democracy will change. What about capital quality of capital? I think that will have a more significant impact on democracy rather than demographics, because capital through advertising it will have an impact on media contents, and the mass receiving that content will form an opinion, and therefore it will have an impact. So I think you should have a friendly capital. A capital that is more friendly to democracy will be a better solution. Do you have any comment?
Well, of course, there's a connection between the capital, or I would call it money, and the functioning of democracy. It's pretty clear that the way democracy no longer functions in the US is because big money becomes too important in the political process itself and in the media and so on. But I still believe that at heart the democracy is a mental system, and it is the product, when it exists, it's a product of a general state of mind in the whole population. And to me, in the US, what makes American democracy, no longer a democracy, is before we come to capital and money and so on, it's the educational stratification, what I would call the atomization, the type of individualism they have in the US, unconnected and unorganized individuals. And this is why it is so difficult to imagine that we can turn back. As a historian, I'm very preoccupied by the question whether we can turn back, whether processes can be reversed. And honestly, well, in a country like France, Europe is a post-democracy, but the European institutions are very clearly post-democratic. You see, if you got a referendum in France, nobody takes cares afterwards, and it's sort of left aside, and so on. And I've been fighting this. I'm also a French citizen, and I've been fighting this for about 25 years, and it's just amazing the way it's impossible to turn back. And now we've got a situation where in France, the state is all powerful. We're about to have a presidential election, which is obviously meaningless in terms of programs, where none of the candidates is able to suggest or propose a new economic policy which would make it possible to block the fall in standard income and get back some kind of industry to produce things. There's no, I mean, this is history. There's no, there are solutions.
Okay.
There are solutions in the future, but they're not moving back to a previous state.
Hi.
With regard to the last question, I think the capital destroyed capitalism, or democracy, excuse me. I think if you read this book, the declining birth rate and the aging of the Japanese society is the most problematic in the society of Japan. And in order to solve these problems, there are 3 items. First one is the acceptance of immigrations and the empowerment of women. And thirdly, acceptance of orderlessness. How do you call it in French? I don't know. But Japan is too orderly. The
big Japanese problem is its obsession with perfection. Well, but I can tell you in France, we are not obsessed with perfection, and we have problems too.
Do you know?
Well, we can continue this discussion that we have, and to terminate, stop here. And thank you very much for an insightful presentation. Emmanuel Todd, thank you very much.
I'm turning emotional because I miss Japan very much. So seeing you was wonderful for me.
ありがとうございました。